Society. And today we are hosting Dr. Andrew Weaver. Dr. Weaver is a small ruminant extension specialist at North Carolina State, and we're happy to have him. Dr. Weaver was really instrumental in helping us grade our carcass class for the 2025 Southern States Show and Sale. This was the first time that we put together a carcass class, and we had over 20 participants. So we're going to have a mini meats class talking about that particular carcass class, and then how we can improve our breed and our carcasses going forward. So without any further, I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Dr. Weaver. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Sounds good. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. And does my screen look all right here? Can you see the
Yes.
sharing properly? Perfect. Well, I thought I'd start off by sharing some slides, kind of an overview of lamb carcass quality, how we assess carcass merit, and give you all an idea of what measurements were taken for the carcass contest. And then I have some summary graphs that show kind of the distribution, some of the metrics that were measured, and what those look like across the population of lambs that were entered in this contest. And so to get started with, if you haven't seen it already, hopefully you have, and have some understanding of the growth curve, but thought I'd share this as kind of an illustration that points out and shows when we're developing market animals, how do those different tissues develop relative to one another, and when do we need to think about kind of an ideal harvest endpoint for those animals to ensure that we have adequate muscle development, some fat but not too much fat, and get the ratios, the proportions of those in an ideal spot. And so if we think about muscle, fat, and bone, the x-axis here would be time as that animal gets older, as it grows, gets heavier. And then we have growth units of each relative tissue on the left, the y-axis. And so you can see here that muscle line on the top, it has that sigmoidal curve, so a little bit slower there early on in life, and it goes through kind of a linear phase of growth, a more rapid phase of growth. They're in the kind of the middle part of its development, and then muscle starts to plateau as time goes on. Bone stays a little bit of growth early on, but then plateaus very early and stays relatively constant. And then fat is interesting because it starts off relatively low and then continues to increase more rapidly as time goes on, as that animal gets older and heavier. So while muscle is starting to plateau as we get to that maturity time point, fat is continuing to increase. And what this graph doesn't bring those two lines completely together, but if you can kind of imagine this graph continuing on to the right, you can imagine muscle plateauing, and really we get to a point where we're not really putting on that much more muscle, and yet fat, if we continue to feed that animal, fat will continue to be accumulated, and that those nutrients that are taken in feed will be converted to fat at that point, which we want some fat from an eating quality standpoint, but we don't want too much fat, because that just turns into trimming losses ultimately that the packer retailer has to take off before putting it in that retail case. And so we think about an ideal harvest endpoint. We think about, remember the fact we consume muscle. Muscle turns to meat. Muscle is actually the product that we are consuming. And so as muscle starts to plateau, fat is increasing, but hasn't gotten to an excessive point at that period of time. And so that is really the ideal harvest endpoint when we think about animal development, market animal development. So that point is going to vary. Even within animals within the same breed, based on types and kinds and how they've been selected and bred, it's going to vary based on sex. And so we really need to understand our own flock, our own animals, and where this point falls for our animals. And that can be a little bit challenging, take some time and experience, but I encourage you to pursue that effort if developing market lambs, and depending on what your market is, paying premiums for, maybe discounting. This may be more or less significant in terms of potential economic impacts. And so I mentioned that sex does have an impact on this. We think about, again, graph looks very similar in terms of X and Y axis. We think about the development of the intact male relative to the castrated male relative to the female. Generally speaking, the intact male is going to be the latest maturing, fastest growing, latest maturing at a specific point in time, they're going to be the trimmest, highest cutability animals. It's going to take them longer to get to a same level of finish or fat cover maturity. The castrated animal for all species except for hogs is intermediate. And then the female is on the bottom there, where the females tend to mature faster, get fatter, are fatter at the same point in time relative to the males. And so with that in mind, whether we leave our lambs intact or we're castrating them, maybe we're feeding out some males with some females, understanding the time and their growth curve and how they're going to develop is really critical to targeting when we market those animals, the weight we market those animals at, understanding that the females are going to mature quick and get fat if we're not careful. The males, to get them to a same level of fatness, they're going to have to weigh more. They're going to be bigger. And so understanding where those kind of ideal time endpoints are relative to sex can also play into achieving that kind of ideal market animal, an ideal carcass that is produced from them. So we think about evaluating lamb. Trimness, muscling, and quality are three attributes that we look at from a meat judging standpoint, you could say. And quality it's a tricky term. It's kind of a confusing term, and I realize that. Quality, as it refers to from a meat science standpoint, quality is referring to the attributes that impact the tenderness, juiciness, and flavor of that final product. So those attributes that impact the eating quality, the eating experience for the end consumer. And so I know you want high quality lamb, right? And sometimes we use that as kind of a blanket term to encapsulate all quality attributes. If we just put our meat science hat on for a second and think about it from that standpoint, quality more specifically refers to tenderness, juiciness, flavor, factors that impact that. And so trimness becomes is the number one priority. Lamb fat is not as desirable as fat on other species. Most of us really like pork fat. If we like bacon, we like pork fat, right? Beef fat, we like well marbled beef. That's going to contribute to that flavor, that eating experience. Lamb fat generally not quite as desirable as fat on those other species. And yet we need a little bit of it. We don't want too much, but we still need a little bit. We'll talk about the reason for that. That trimness can be evaluated and thought of in terms of our USDA yield grade. We'll talk about how that is calculated here in a minute. And then quality is brought into through the USDA quality grade metric. And one of the interesting different things about lamb relative to beef is that we actually include some of our muscling characteristics, carcass conformation characteristics into our USDA quality grade, where in our other species, muscling is included in yield grade equation. And so a little bit different there. The USDA yield grade equation for lamb does not include muscle. And so while it's a predictor of cutability, it only includes fat metrics. That yield grade equation is really important and plays into value determination in a more traditional market with through large packers and how they're valuing lambs and paying their producers or who they're buying lambs from. This is primarily in the Western United States. Here in the East, we don't see a lot of lambs that are yield graded or paid off that yield grade. And that's because we have a very strong non-traditional market here in the East. Texas would be the same way. And so we see in most of these non-traditional markets, lambs are going through, maybe graded live sales, where lambs are graded, assigned a quality grade based on visual appraisal. And that visual appraisal is oriented towards, evaluating thickness, shapeliness, and muscling attributes. But it's all visual, right? We're not actually collecting any carcass measurements when we're doing that. So they're sold on a live basis. They're graded live. And we're just kind of hoping those lambs, then produce good carcasses as a result of that and sorted and valued accordingly. But we're not actually taking USDA yield or quality grades on those non-traditional lambs. So dressing percentage is one of the first metrics that we typically look at when evaluating kind of yield, carcass yield relative to live weight. And so we calculate dressing percentage as simply the hot carcass weight relative to the live weight, multiply it by 100 to get it to a percentage. Normal range is about 45 to 57%. And there's a lot of factors that are going to impact what this dressing percentage is. So, average, probably a little over 50% for sheep that are shorn, short fleeced animals, meat breed, meat type animals. It's probably closer to 49 or 50% for a lot of our hair sheep. And we'll talk about, here are the reasons and some of those factors that impact that. Fleece length has a negative impact on dressing percentage. The longer the fleece, if your sheep have a little bit thicker coat, that is weight that's going to contribute to the live weight, but is then removed at harvest, so it doesn't contribute to carcass weight. And so the longer the fleece length, the thicker the coat, the lower the dressing percentage is going to be. Gut fill. So how much rumen fill do they have? Do they have a full gut when you weigh them live? Obviously, that's removed at the time of harvest. So if they have a full gut and they're weighed and then harvested, their carcass weight relative to that live weight is going to be lower. Fat and muscle, actually both of those have a positive impact on dressing percentage. So the fatter they are, the heavier muscled they are, the higher that dressing percentage is going to be, because fat and muscle stay on the carcass. And so the more of that relative to live weight, the higher the dressing percentage. And so lots of things to consider here. I didn't include, the presence of horns would also play into dressing percentage. If we have horned animals, those horns are removed when the head is taken off. And so that's going to contribute. The horns would contribute to live weight, would not contribute to carcass weight. And so that would lower dressing percentage. The presence of horns would lower dressing percentage. So there's a number of factors here that play into this. In many of our hair breeds, if sheep are lighter muscled, leaner, at the time of harvest, they're typically going to have lower dressing percentages. Where if we have meat type animals, really heavy, muscled, stout, thick animals that have some fat cover on them, that are in relatively short fleece or short hair length at the time of harvest, those are going to have much higher dressing percentages. Fat thickness, fat depth. This is measured between the 12th and the 13th rib. And so ribbing, when I refer to ribbing, I'm simply referring to splitting that carcass kind of in half between the 12th and the 13th rib. So lambs have 13 pairs of ribs, which means that there's 12 ribs in the foresaddle, the front end of the carcass, and there'd be one rib left over in the hind saddle, the back end of the carcass. And so they're split in the same spot on all carcasses. We measure this in the same location on all carcasses. And when we do carcass ultrasounds on live animals, we're also doing that carcass ultrasound at that same location. So you can palpate and you can feel where that 13th rib is, where that last rib is, and you go one rib forward in between that last rib and the second to last rib, and that's where you're going to take your carcass ultrasound measurement. So you're measuring it the same location on the live animal as you measure it on the carcass. So the normal range here, we want at least 1/10 of an inch of back fat, up to 0.35, and there's a reason for that 0.35 number. And we want to try to not exceed that. That would be associated with, when we get above that number, we're in that yield grade 4 range, which is generally undesirable. Most lamb carcasses, and when we talk to buyers that are working in the more traditional lamb industry, they're seeking carcasses that are somewhere in that 0.2 of an inch range. So 0.2, 0.25, somewhere in there, maybe up to 0.3, would be kind of the generally acceptable range for having enough external fat to minimize evaporative losses, ensure that those animals cut well and have a desirable chop when that's harvested, and when those carcasses are fabricated, and hold that muscle shape well. But at the same time, don't have excessive fat where you're going to have, excessive trimming losses and that waste product being generated. And so, generally speaking, we need at least 1/10 of an inch of back fat to prevent excessive evaporative losses. And what I mean by that is when those animals are harvested, they're at normal body temperature, 102.5. They are after they come off the harvest floor. They're moved to a cooler where they're chilled. To minimize any development of bacteria. It's a food safety thing that we bring those animals into. We don't freeze them, but we take them into a cooler to be chilled. Allow that transition from muscle to meat to take place. And so during that process, and it's just like when we walk outside on a nice cool morning and you can see our breath in the air, those carcasses, you take a carcass that, from the time they're harvested to the time they go into the cooler, could be just, several minutes. It could be a very short period of time. And so that carcass really hasn't chilled much on the kill floor. And so when they move into the cooler, they're still relatively warm, right? So you can imagine rolling something that weighs 100 or that is 100 degrees, rolling that into a cooler that is, 38 to 40 degrees. And so you're taking something warm, moving into that cooler environment, and you can even sometimes see that evaporative loss is taking place. You can see the moisture in the air being lost. Well, you think about that moisture, we don't want to eat dry meat, right? We want to eat something that's juicy and tender and has that flavor. And so it's really important that we try to contain and minimize those evaporative losses. When we have a carcass that's extremely trim, that has little to no external fat over it, it allows that water to escape. Remember, fat, oil, and water don't get along. When you put vegetable oil in some water, you see it beat up. Oils and water don't agree with one another. They don't like to mix together. And so you can imagine when we put that fat covering over the carcass, you can almost kind of think of it as a seal. That water that's contained in the muscle inside that carcass, when there's a fat layer, an adequate fat layer on top of it, it minimizes the amount of water that can escape through that fat and then evaporate. If we have a carcass that has very little to no external fat, a lot of that water can just be lost during that cooling process. And so while it's very standard to see maybe 1.5% to 3% loss in carcass weight from a hot carcass to a chilled carcass, during that cooling process, we want to make sure it's not in excess of that. And so we need a little bit of back fat. We need at least 1/10 of an inch. Any less than that, we really get concerned about excessive evaporative losses and the negative impact, the detriment that will have to the eating experience of that final product. Body wall thickness is another measurement that we take. Body wall thickness just allows us to better evaluate what is the true fat cover on those animals. Sometimes during the skinning process, when that hide is removed, sometimes a little bit of that fat goes with it. And so the body wall, most of what contributes to the thickness of that body wall is fat. And so that body wall gives us a secondary fat measurement to be able to adjust our back fat measurement to get a more accurate depiction of back fat thickness. Here, the normal range, 0.6 to 1.2, average maybe about 0.8. And our yield grade is going to be based on that adjusted 12th rib fat thickness. So when you hear me say adjusted 12th rib fat thickness, I'm taking the fat thickness, the 12th rib fat thickness, adjusting it based on body wall thickness to get that final fat thickness measurement. And so this is the table that I use to adjust that. And so what this looks like, let's just walk through an example here. If the adjusted 12th rib, or if the 12th rib fat thickness, the back fat thickness is 0.21, and the body wall thickness is 0.9, what is the adjusted 12th rib fat thickness? And so in that column for 12th rib fat thickness, I find that 0.21. Then I go over to the body wall thickness column, find 0.9. So with a body wall thickness of 0.9, I would expect a lamb with a body wall thickness of 0.9 to have a rib fat thickness of 0.31. So it actually, the 12th rib fat thickness is a little bit less than what I would expect based on the body wall thickness. What does that tell me? Well, maybe I need to adjust that 12th rib fat thickness up a little bit. I need to increase that a little bit. And so I take the average of 0.31 and 0.21, I get 0.26. And so the adjusted 12th rib fat thickness here would be 0.26 inches, the average of the actual 12th rib fat thickness and the expected 12th rib fat thickness based on the body wall thickness. I do not adjust this any more than 1/10 of an inch. And so, based for that 12th rib fat thickness, that's your baseline, that's your starting point. And I don't go any more than 1/10 of an inch from whatever that original 12th rib fat thickness is. And so we take that adjusted 12th rib fat thickness number, plug it into our yield grade equation, which is relatively straightforward for sheep. The adjusted 12th rib fat thickness times 10 plus 0.4. And so if the adjusted 12th rib fat thickness is 0.26, we just move the decimal point over one, 2.6, add 0.4, and we come up with a yield grade of 3. And so relatively simple and easy to calculate. And so this would be yield grade 3 carcass, just in our example here. Some other examples here, this would be a lamb that has a fat thickness of 0.15, a relatively trim lamb, not a lot of external fat. Ribeye area is 3.4, but remember, that muscling metric does not play into the yield grade equation in sheep. And so here the yield grade would be 1.9. So a relatively trim, high cutability type carcass here. And you can see from the image on the left, we want our lambs to look like Coke bottles. We want them to have some shapeliness, some curvature. And so we want our lamb carcasses, think of them, you want to try to make them look like a Coke bottle. This would be the opposite extreme, right? Fat thickness of 0.45, very fat, very low cutability. Ribeye area is 2.4. Here the yield grade would be 4.9. So very, very fat, almost yield grade 5. And here our carcass appears to be more like a canoe. The widest point of that carcass is right in the middle. And we know that is most of that. The reason for that is excessive fat deposition. And so we want our lambs to look like Coke bottles and not canoes. So those are our fat metrics. Moving on to some muscle metrics here. Ribeye area. This would be the area of the longissimus muscle, that ribeye muscle. If you're a deer hunter, it'd be the back strap. So it's the area of that muscle, cross section of that muscle between the 12th and the 13th ribs. Here, the normal range, 1.5 to 3.6 inches squared, with the average about 2.5. And so how we get to this number, this area number, we have these ribeye grids. And so these grids have lots of dots on them. And each dot on a lamb grid is equivalent to 0.05 square inches. So 20 dots per square inch. So you simply put the grid over that ribeye. You count up the number of dots that are touching that longissimus muscle. And then you just do a little bit of math to convert the number of dots you counted to square inches. And so it allows us, it's a pretty easy way for us to determine an area measurement without doing, real complicated, computer algorithms to get to that number. We can do this in the cooler. So that's how we get our area number. Keep in mind that in a commercial lamb plant, lamb carcasses are not ribbed. And so this ribbing practice where we split the carcass between the 12th and the 13th rib, we do that on a small scale. We can do it for these carcass contests. We can do it from a research standpoint, but in a commercial large-scale lamb plant, they're not getting ribbed. And so while we can measure ribeye area, we can measure fat depth exactly in these smaller scale type scenarios. In a large-scale lamb plant, that's not getting done. That can't be done because the lambs aren't ribbed. That interface is not opened up to where you can see and measure the ribeye area and the fat depth directly. And so instead, we look at more of carcass conformation attributes on those, leg scores, shapeliness of that carcass as an indicator for muscularity. And here we can use a numerical system to evaluate that shape, that score. And so a 15 would be our highest scores assigned to extremely thick muscling, those high prime type conformations. 9 would be associated with very thin muscling, a high good. And kind of the funny thing with lamb and quality grades, and don't shoot the messenger, I didn't come up with it. Good carcasses are actually bad. And I know that sounds funny, probably doesn't make any sense to you. It might make more sense on the next slide. But we actually, the grade below choice is actually referred to as good. We want our lambs to grade choice and prime. We don't want good grading lambs. I know that's confusing. Most of our lambs fall in that kind of choice score, choice confirmation grade, somewhere between a 10 and a 12. We get some 13s, that low prime, fair amounts as well. And so our USDA quality grade is based on maturity, so age of the carcass, flank streaking, and this confirmation score. And keep in mind that for lambs to be eligible to be quality graded, they need at least 1/10 of an inch of back fat. And just a reminder, the reason for that, it goes back to preventing excessive evaporative losses. And so quality grade, remember we talked about that being all about those factors that impact the tenderness, juiciness, and flavor of the final product. Well, if we have excessive evaporative losses, we lose a lot of that moisture. That's going to have a direct impact on the tenderness, juiciness, and flavor of that product that we are then marketing. And so we need to have an adequate amount of back fat, not too much, but an adequate amount, to be able to ensure to the best of our ability that we're going to have a high quality product that's going to have a favorable eating experience by that end consumer. And so how do we evaluate maturity? Couple locations we can look at to evaluate maturity. One thing we look at is the break joint on the front legs. And so we're looking for the presence of a break joint rather than a spool joint. And so I have a couple pictures here to illustrate this. On the left, you'll see a spool joint, literally looks like a spool of thread. And on the right, you see that break joint. And so I have the actual images here as well as the illustrations on the left. So there's a cartilage in that joint there. That cartilage will turn to bone as those animals get older and get more mature. And so when they're young, and there's still cartilage in that joint, when you take the front legs off, it breaks off, that front leg breaks off at the break joint. Where when that animal gets older and that cartilage ossifies to bone, when you go to take the front legs off, because it's bone, it doesn't break. And so instead it breaks off at the spool joint, one joint further down that leg. And now you have that spool joint, appearance. Two spool joints, the presence of two spool joints would classify that a lamb as now being mutton. And so as long as they have one break joint, they're considered lamb. Two spool joints is considered mutton. We also look at the color of the lean and the flank region. We want that flank color to be bright, light colored, kind of a bright pinkish red color, rather than a real dark red type color. That darker coloration would be an indicator of an older animal. And then we also look at the rib bones. We want red round rib bones. We do not want white flat rib bones. So then we take that maturity metric, and then we collect our flank streaking metric. And so flank streaking is our indicator of marbling. Like I said, in a large scale commercial lamb plant, we're not ribbing carcasses. We're not able to visualize that cross section of that ribeye muscle, that longissimus muscle. So instead, we need an indicator trait that would tell us, okay, this animal is depositing more fat, is likely to have more marbling that would contribute to that positive eating experience like it does for beef. In beef, in large beef plants, all carcasses are ribbed. And so we're able to evaluate, intramuscular fat in each carcass. In a lamb plant, we can't do that. And so we use flank streaking as our indicator trait. So we're looking at the amount of fat that's deposited on the inside of that flank. So you can open up that flank on the carcass, compare that to our USDA standards, evaluate how much fat is there, and determine that flank streaking score. And so we determined the degrees of flank streaking very similar to like degrees of marbling in beef. That would be on the y-axis there. And then we determine maturity, the age across the what would be the x-axis there, here shown on the top. And so you simply plot a point on this chart. And so based on where that point falls, the lamb is classified on prime, choice, good, utility, or cull. Like I said, we want our lambs, and most lambs grade choice and prime. 95% of lambs in America grade choice and prime. Good lambs are actually bad. We don't want good lambs. We want our lambs to grade choice or prime. And then within each one of these grades, we do have, they're kind of broken into thirds. So we have low choice, average choice, and high choice. We have low prime, average prime, and high prime. One of the unique things about lamb is that we take that quality grade determined by the chart on the last slide, and then we adjust that based on conformation score. So we take that leg score, that conformation that we talked about before, that indicator of muscling, and then we adjust that grade. We adjust that quality grade. And so we can move that grade up, maybe up a third, down a third based on that conformation. One thing to keep in mind, conformation score alone cannot move a carcass into the prime grade. They have to have sufficient flank streaking and be appropriate maturity to grade prime. And then conformation, can keep them in prime, but we can't take an animal over that choice prime line by simply having an animal that has better conformation. They have to have the flank streaking to get there as well. We talk a lot about quality grades in live markets as well, auction markets, and this is based on that visual appraisal of conformation and shapeliness. And so from a live grading standpoint, you'll see on your market reports, prime and choice lambs, choice and good. You'll see those different grades, and we have that market report broken out by those different grades and then weights within those different grades. But keep in mind, that's all done on a live basis. That's all visual appraisal of composition, how much muscle there is relative to fat. Muscle is round, fat is smooth. So the more shapely an animal is, the more curvature they have, the rounder they are. Generally, we think of those animals being heavier muscled. Fat is smooth, fat fills in all the gaps. So an animal that's very smooth, that's kind of shapeless, would be an animal that tends to be fatter and lighter muscled. And so we have trained graders that are grading these animals and sorting them into groups based on grade, and it's all visual. No measurements are done on the actual carcass on the back end, in a especially like a non-traditional type basis. So that's a little bit of an overview of the grading system, both from a yield standpoint and a quality standpoint. I have a few slides here that we'll move into, discussing more specifically the carcass contest and how the ranking was done. So I used the North Dakota indexing system, and there's some pros and cons with how lamb carcasses are evaluated and ranked in these carcass contests. The one thing I really like about carcass evaluation, what I enjoyed about being on a meat judging team back when I was in college, is it's very objective. You're taking data, you're measuring carcass attributes, and then there's a very specific system to ranking better from worse, where livestock judging, live animal evaluation can get a little bit more subjective, right? We have, certain individuals like certain things a little bit more on a live basis than others, and we have, different priorities and ranking systems on a live basis. On a carcass basis, things get a little bit more exact, and we simply go into the cooler and we take measurements, and then we rank those animals based on those exact measurements. And so, a few different ways to look at doing or ranking a carcass contest in terms of what are we going to do it purely from a yield standpoint based on percent boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts, or are we going to maybe include some better muscling attributes relative to carcass weight, and that's where I do kind of prefer the North Dakota system. That's why I used it for this contest. So the North Dakota system uses an indexing system. It starts off with a base value of 80. Takes into account the yield grade, so baseline yield grade of 1.5, and then for each additional tenth of an inch, or there's an additional 0.1 up or down on yield grade. It would be associated with a change in the indexing system unit of 0.25. This is the part I really like about this system is the carcass weight and the required ribeye area, muscle area, loin muscle area relative to carcass weight. And so now we're ensuring that for a given carcass weight, does that animal have sufficient muscling? And so you can see the breakdown here of different carcass weight ranges, and then the required ribeye area relative to that carcass weight. We know as animals get heavier, they should have a larger ribeye area. And so here for each tenth of a square inch, increase or decrease from the required ribeye area, we're going to change plus or minus a unit on that indexing system. And so I looked at, what was the carcass weight of that animal? What was the required ribeye area based on that carcass weight? And then assigned the unit score based on the difference between the actual ribeye area and the required ribeye area based on carcass weight. It then factors in body wall thickness, with the base being 0.8, and then for every tenth of an inch plus or minus, we go up or down 2 units on the indexing system, and then leg scores built in there as well as a secondary muscling attribute, where we can improved leg score, improved shapeliness of the carcass is going to add to the score in a positive way on this index system. And so I like this system in terms of its ability to evaluate, true carcass merit, improved carcass merit relative to, increased muscularity relative to body weight and carcass weight. And carcass weight alone does not have as big of an impact. And we're not just rewarding really small, super trim carcasses that, maybe suffer from a quality standpoint. Where I have some concerns with the percent boneless closer to retail cuts equation, and it uses a lot of similar metrics. But generally speaking, that equation is going to favor lambs that are extremely lightweight, small carcasses, very trim, very lean. And so we talked about the issues with that associated with quality and eating experience. It's hard if all the lambs are the same size and all the carcasses weigh about the same, then it can probably be used. But when you have significant variation in carcass weight, like we did with this contest, and we had some very, very light, small carcasses, we had some pretty good sized carcasses too. So you have a huge variation in carcass weight. That equation is very hard to use in that scenario to accurately evaluate which ones have truly better carcass merit relative to that carcass weight versus which ones maybe are just smaller and trimmer because they're smaller. So again, there can be some debate here, and I've heard some discussion, at many time points that some people prefer one versus another. I just decided in this scenario to use the indexing system. I'll open to discussion and hearing feedback from you all in terms of what you would prefer. Ultimately, this is your contest, your class, your breed association, and so how you see it being most beneficial for you all as breeders of Dorper sheep. I'm happy to have the conversation and potentially, if this is something we continue to do in the future, what does that look like, and how do you want carcasses evaluated so it's most beneficial to you and your breed and what your breed's trying to do. From a statistic standpoint, if we think about, I just want to show some kind of summary data from the contest. Dressing percent. This is just ranked, the lamb with the lowest dressing percentage to the lamb with the highest dressing percentage, ranged from about 53% up to about 65%. So actually really good dressing percentages, higher than I would expect. And one of the reasons I think for that, this was a halal plant. These lambs were processed at. It is their kind of standard practice to leave they skin everything, but they leave the actual heads on. And so the heads are included in the carcass weight. And so that head weighs something, right? And so it's contributing to carcass weight. And so the carcass weight relative to live weight would be higher than the average carcass where the skull is removed. And so that's probably shifted these dressing percentages towards the higher side, higher than average side. And so probably if we back these off a couple percent, few percent, maybe more accurate of what a traditionally normal carcass would be with the head removed. Yield grade distribution, over 50% yield grade ones, very trim. About a third of the contest would have been yield grade twos, and 14% yield grade threes, no fours, no fives. So from a yield grade standpoint, very trim, very high cutability carcasses. On the quality grade side of things, this is where we ran into a few issues, and only had about 17% high choice, about a quarter of the contest was average choice, 21% low choice. And we had a lot of carcasses with less than 1/10 of an inch of back fat. And so I kind of take away, and it caught me very quickly when I walked in the cooler, caught my attention in terms of the majority, a lot of the carcasses that were in the contest were extremely trim and probably on the excessive side of trim. They were a little bit smaller than what I expected them to be, trimmer than what I expected them to be. And as a result of that, while we see, very favorable yield grade in terms of being, those low yield grade scores, from a quality grade perspective, we need a little bit more fat. And it would have been okay to add a little bit of fat, maybe have a higher percentage of yield grade 2, yield grade 3 carcasses. Yield grade 4 is bad, but yield grade 2, yield grade 3 are actually preferred by a lot of buyers. So it would have been okay to shift that distribution a little bit more to the right towards those yield grade 2, yield grade 3s. And then by adding a little bit of external fat, by adding a little bit of maturity to those animals, we would have also probably seen a favorable shift in the quality grade distribution here. We probably would have seen more carcasses in the high choice category, the average choice category. Potential would have existed to even get maybe some lambs up into the prime category, and we would have had a lot more that would have been eligible for grading, having greater than 1/10 of an inch of back fat. Distribution of actual ribeye area relative to required ribeye area. Again, we're a little bit on the low side, right? We had a lot of animals that their actual ribeye area was less than what that required ribeye area is relative to carcass weight. And so this is another distribution that would have liked to see this shifted a little bit more to the right in terms of having equal to or larger ribeye areas relative to what that required ribeye area is for that carcass weight. And so my general overarching observations, lambs, as I mentioned, were very trim, not very much fat. A lot had less than 1/10 of an inch of back fat, so we need to work on that. And it's not a bad thing to have more yield grade 2, yield grade 3s. And I hear a lot of discussion about, lambs that are in that 2/10 of an inch to 3/10 of an inch back fat range is actually the preferred range. And so it's okay to get them up into, a little bit more fat on them. Not too much, but to have a little bit more is not a bad thing. Based on how trim everything all these lambs were, where they were relative to, muscling relative to required ribeye area, I think a lot of these lambs were probably harvested before their ideal endpoint. So if we go back to that, one of the first slides there when we talk about the growth curve and the development of muscle relative to the development of fat, we were probably further to the left than where we should have been for a lot of lambs. It probably would not have hurt to shift to the right on that growth curve a little bit and get those lambs a little bit bigger, put a little bit more fat on them, get muscling up a little bit closer to where that starts to plateau and where we can get the most bang for our buck in terms of getting the most out of that animal in terms of that ideal kind of harvest endpoint. And so by feeding them a little bit longer, having a little bit more mature, we would have ended up with heavier carcasses, more available product to sell. Quality grades would have probably improved, and we really wouldn't have sacrificed that much in terms of trimming losses. So there's room there, there's opportunity there to improve carcass weight, marketable product, while not exceeding that threshold for on the opposite end for having too much fat, if that makes sense. And I think one thing that we need to discuss, you all discuss as a breed, and happy to share my 2 cents relative to this as well. But how should we be evaluating these carcasses? The way the contest was evaluated this year was very much from a kind of a traditional market standpoint. And in terms of evaluating yield and quality and ranking those animals that index well relative to the amount of their cutability, their yield grade, muscularity, and leg scores. And that's fine if that's the direction you all want to go as a breed. I think we also need to consider the non-traditional market because that is where a lot of our lambs are ending up. And so that non-traditional market, especially here in the East, our buyers want a lamb that produces a carcass that weighs less than 40 pounds, which means if 50% dress, that means a max weight of 80, 85 pounds at most. And so they want a carcass less than 40 pounds. They want as much muscling as they can get at less than 40 pound carcass. The number one priority is carcass weight. And having them weigh less than 40 pounds, the carcasses weigh less than 40 pounds is the number one most important thing. Beyond that, sure, some extra muscling is great, but they're not going to take the extra muscling at the cost of having carcasses that are too big, too heavy. And so we need to think about that. Think about the fact that in these non-traditional markets, there is no reward, no value determination based on a USDA yield grade, a quality grade, a ribeye area, any of that. It's all visual appraisal of conformation, of shapeliness, animal, visual, live, carcass conformation, or animal conformation, I should say. So with all that in mind, it becomes a lot more challenging to maybe set of standards for lamb carcass evaluation in a non-traditional sense, because really we're just looking at weight, and then if they're heavy muscle, great, but they're not paying me for that. So what value does it what value does it provide to me to make them heavier muscle if the market isn't paying me for the extra muscle? And so I'm not saying that I agree with that system, but it's just the way it works and what we have to work with today. So the thicker the better. I'm all for that. The heavier muscle, the better. All for that. In a non-traditional trade, though, we got to be conscientious of who our customer is, what that market is, and make sure that we don't produce a lamb that's too big, too heavy for what they're desiring. And so finding a happy medium, I think, is important, and it's something I'm not going to tell you do it this way or do it that way. I think it's up for discussion and debate, and so I'll leave you with that. And I'm not sure who all is on or if you have any questions, but happy to to dive into more details if you would like. So.
Yeah, so Dr. Weaver, this is Carla Blackstock. And we had a couple of questions that had been kind of submitted to us and that weren't going to be here. So one of the things that, and I talked to you a little bit about this earlier, was, the way that a commercial breeder can identify the ideal market animal, because obviously they're not going to have the luxury of taking those animals and having, one or two judged at a carcass class. So, based off of the dressing percentage, knowing that Dorpers are very quick to mature, they're very early maturing, how would we direct our commercial breeders into maybe looking to identify where that perfect sweet spot is on the market?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of the classic extension response. It depends. I think having the conversation with commercial breeders about, what is their market, what is their market rewarding a premium for, and then where are they potentially placing a discount. If it's a more traditional type market, if lambs are being sold maybe at a little bit heavier weights, carcass weights of maybe 60, 70 pounds. So heavier carcass weights, maybe those markets that are more direct to consumer in terms of maybe farmers markets, and those restaurant, grocery store, straight to end consumer type sales where you're putting a lamb chop on the dinner plate of an American consumer. If that is the end destination for that lamb, then I think having that discussion about where is that ideal harvest point. Let's make sure we get enough fat cover on them that we minimize excessive evaporative losses, that we put a little bit of marbling into them, and that we have that really favorable, desirable eating experience for that end consumer. I think that's the direction we go. If we have commercial producers who are trying to sell lightweight lambs around the times of these religious holidays into a non-traditional ethnic type trade, I think the conversation to have is, who is that customer? What is that? Are they going? Are you taking them and dropping them off at that ethnic processing plant? Are you taking them to a sale barn? Are they going through San Angelo? Are they going through New Holland, Mount Hope before they end up at the ethnic customer? What is that route to the customer? What is that customer paying for a premium for? And where is the premium to be had? And it's going to vary a little bit based on time of year. We know there's some holidays where they want an 80, 90, 95 pound intact male, right? And they're willing to take those heavier lambs at that time of year. But that's one specific holiday. As soon as that holiday's over, they're back to only wanting lambs that weigh 60 to 80 pounds. And so I think watching market reports and trends in market reports and understanding which holidays are approaching, what is that holiday, based on that holiday, what is the market desiring, and trying to tailor lambs to have them available in market lambs that are best suited for that holiday at that specific time. And planning ahead for that, knowing where the trends are going in terms of, okay, I can add value up to this weight, and then after this weight, that's where I'm really seeing the drop off in terms of market value. I can add value by making animals that instead of being in that choice and good grade, they're now in the choice and prime grade. I've shifted them up in terms of a visual appraisal, in terms of confirmation score, and so those animals are grading better on a live basis. Now, this is all live basis, so they're grading better live. They're entering and receiving premiums because they're thicker, have more shapeliness to them while they're live at that auction market. And for that weight class, I'm receiving a premium for that as a result. And so, unfortunately, it's not like one size fits all. And I think this is an opportunity. It's maybe a benefit. It's a positive thing for the sheep industry, in that there's a market for all types and kinds, right? There's a market for small, lightweight, trim lambs. There's a market for heavier weight lambs, have a little bit more fat cover to them. It's just making sure that the lambs that we're raising, the genetics that we have, the sheep we're breeding and selecting for, fit the marketing avenues that we plan to pursue. Where we get ourselves in trouble is if we're trying to breed one type of sheep and the market's paying us for a different type of sheep, if that makes sense. So that might have been a long-winded way to get maybe to your answer. Hopefully that.
It does, and I think that one of the things that's as a breed registry that we are trying uh, to put out is that we support the commercial breeders, we support the seed stock breeders, those that are in the ring, and ultimately they have to kind of match. So, what we're showing in the ring, and what we're doing in our show and sales right now by gathering some of those the loin eye, those ribeye numbers. We're trying to see and to collect enough data to one day be able to have some of those cattle EPDs and things, but I know we don't right now. But we're trying to really showcase and see which animals and what types of animals are having the larger ribeyes, and making sure those are our production oriented, that we're sending to the seed stock, because then they're sending those out to commercial breeders. So this is just there's a great connection between those, and instead of drawing a divide, we need to be able to see which different pieces of that can help the different producers. And so I know that we aren't there yet with cattle, like the cattle are with the EPDs, but we're trying to get some data available to breeders, and just so that we can start calculating it. Can you talk to me a little bit about maybe how that live ribeye, those scans, then how accurate are those? How are those when you get down to the carcass? What does that mean to someone?
Yeah. So generally speaking, muscle is proportional. So improved muscling in one area of the carcass is going to have it'd be associated with an improvement in muscling in other areas as well. So if we look at forearm shape, if we look at ribeye area, those muscling indicators should be indicative of improved muscling throughout the entire animal. And so that's where ribeye scans, ultrasound scanning comes into play. It's a relatively easy location to get a muscling measurement, an ultrasound measurement for that ribeye area, that muscling, and that is generally indicative of improved muscling throughout. So we could, in taking a more objective approach to selection, measure those ribeye areas and use that in our selection objectives to improve muscularity of our lambs. We talked about, on a live basis, lambs are graded based on visual appraisal of animal shapeliness. And so while in an auction barn, we're not measuring ribeye area, in a non-traditional market, we're not measuring actual ribeye area. Even in a traditional market, we're not measuring actual ribeye area. But using ribeye area as a selection tool can allow us to more objectively select animals that are heavier muscled, should be heavier muscled throughout, and because of that, hopefully achieve those higher grades, be more shapely, and achieve, whether it's in a traditional carcass grading or in a non-traditional live evaluation, hopefully achieve those higher grades and receive some premiums for that.
Well, thank you. That definitely, I think, helps us as we try to continue to collect more information. And I had one question that had come up from a couple of individuals, and we don't have the results right in front of us. I don't know if you've got those, but on the end of that column where we've discussed the carcass class itself in Cookeville, one of the things that it is the quality grade, and you've got the choice plus, and talk to us a little bit about why you may have a choice, the low choice on the winning a class in the carcass class over just a choice or a choice plus, because I know there's a lot of factors that go into that, and you've been through a lot of those, but can you drill down real quick and talk a little bit about that quality grade, and maybe what that does or doesn't mean at the end of the day in a carcass class?
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember, the vast majority of lambs in America grade choice and prime. And so, choices, we have kind of, we break that choice grade down into thirds. And so while there is a difference between low choice and high choice, it's not a major difference. And I think we weight that, and where you see in the carcass contest, that was weighted in consideration with a lot of other metrics, right? So we use that indexing system that took into account the yield grade, the muscularity, body wall thickness, leg scores, and so all of those animals were indexed, and then the question was asked, do they have an acceptable or unacceptable quality grade? And so where those lambs sorted themselves to the bottom were those lambs that didn't have sufficient back fat, didn't have enough, as a result of not having enough back fat, probably had less than ideal flank streaking and negative impacts on potential eating quality. And so those animals went to the bottom. Animals that had sufficient back fat, that were acceptable in terms of quality grade, and that could have been low choice or high choice. But then after that, or I should say, based on the indexing system, they were ranked assuming that they fell in that acceptable quality, one of those acceptable quality grades. And so, while quality grade itself was not in the index, they were kind of pre-sorted based on quality grade in terms of which ones were eligibly graded, which ones had acceptable quality grades, versus which ones did not. And then within that, they were ranked based on that index that considered the cutability and fat muscling attributes.
So for the producer, the somebody who's bringing this to a carcass class, there's a lot of data that you've pulled, and there's a lot of great information, but you can't look at any one column and say this is a sort mechanism, because you've used that indexing, and it's not a simple Excel spreadsheet where you can filter one column and have the winners at the top of the list. And I think that's what we're trying. My thought is that we're trying to get across that there's so much that goes into this, that it's not being able to look at one and say, well, I had a larger ribeye area, I should have moved up a couple. I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into this, and there should be, and I think that's great. But I think that's one thing to get across to our breeders and producers, is that there's, if you could just select for one trait, it would be simple. But you've got to look at the animal as a whole.
That's a great point. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. There's a multitude of different factors, and so the animal that wins probably isn't the animal that's extreme for any one factor, any one trait, but is very good for all. And so it's the weighting of all those different things, like you said. And so one thing, like, I'm always careful in terms of like that ribeye area measurement. Like it's really easy to brag and say, like, oh, I had the biggest ribeye area. Well, okay, that's great, but did you have the biggest carcass? Was it the smallest carcass? There's that ribeye area is highly dependent on carcass size. And so if you have the biggest ribeye area, but you also have the biggest carcass, ribeye area on a per pound of carcass weight basis might not be the biggest. So raw ribeye area alone has to be evaluated relative to carcass weight. It cannot be looked at as just a single metric. If you have a very heavy muscled animal, large ribeye area with a lighter carcass weight, or lighter than expected, then that's, to me, that's a higher cutability, a higher carcass merit animal, because at an equivalent carcass weight, it has greater than expected muscling for that weight.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think we're finishing up on our hour here, Dr. Weaver. This has been very insightful for me. I think this will be great information as we put this out to our breeders and our members. And I greatly appreciate you, and I greatly appreciate what you did for us at the Southern States in grading this and getting this information over to us. There's also going to be an article and the results of that published in the 2025 fall edition of the Dorper Report. So if anybody needs to follow up or wants additional information, it will be in that report as well as online. So Dr. Weaver, thanks again. I appreciate your time, and we look forward to working with you down the road.
Thanks for having me. Let me know if I can answer any questions or help in any way along in the future.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.